Hi, welcome to Unit 4, Facilitate Responsible Behaviour. Imagine this, you're a boarding supervisor at a boarding school in a large country town. It's a hot Saturday afternoon and you're the staff member on duty with 10 students in the outdoor pool area, and your co-worker is supervising a large group of students inside the residence. Josiah and Andy have been teasing each other in the swimming pool area. Now Andy is suddenly looking very angry and is chasing Josiah around, both boys running on the wet tiled area of the pool. So, how do you immediately respond to this behaviour? How do you effectively monitor and observe students to intervene earlier? How can your interactions with students reduce this sort of behaviour? How can you develop a boarding culture that enables positive behaviours? The answers to those questions and lots of other questions are in this Unit 4, Facilitate Responsible Behaviour. There are 6 parts to Unit 4: residence culture, interactions with students, observe and monitor, responding to student behaviours, aggressive and violent behaviours, self-harm and suicide. The first part of this unit is about residence culture, or setting the foundation for positive behaviours. Effective boarding practice creates a strong current of positive student behaviour, all heading in the same direction, much like a strongly flowing river. Students entering the river will be drawn along by this current of positive behaviours. We call it the river of positive student behaviour. New students get drawn into that river because of the very strong current of positive behaviours. Now, this strong current of positive behaviours requires a dynamic, positive residence culture. Research shows that there are key factors that contribute to creating this positive culture. And your first question is based on this. It says, in the notes there are 7 factors for a positive residence culture. Select 3 you see as the most important and explain why. So let's have a look at these factors. The first is respect. Everyone in the residence is treated with respect and sees themselves as a person of value. So think about what specific actions to ensure that this occurs. The second is about caring. Everyone feels that others are concerned about them and interested in their well-being. So think about, again, what specific actions ensure that this will occur. High morale. Everybody feels good about what is happening, and they're willing to perform assigned tasks. They're confident, cheerful, and self-disciplined. And again, just think about what specific actions in boarding will ensure that this occurs. And then there's opportunities for input. So everyone in the residence is given the opportunity to contribute ideas and know that they've been considered. So think about, what specific actions are going to make this happen. The next is continuous growth and renewal. Everyone strives to develop their skills and knowledge. Boarding staff hold high expectations for students and themselves. What actions are going to make sure that this happens? And then we have cohesiveness. Residence members feel a sense of belonging that results in a positive residence culture. So what is going to make that occur? Trust. Everyone has confidence that others can be counted on to say what they will do. Integrity is an essential characteristic of residence members. So how can we make sure that that occurs? And so from those, if you can pick 3 of them, the 3 that you think are most important, and then also explain why you think they are important. So a dynamic, positive residence culture also needs a physical environment that's clean, vibrant, homely, and activities that are interesting and engaging. And in talking about engagement, Eric Jensen says, we often treat the symptoms, and I think here he's talking about the symptoms of poor behaviour, with strategies and not the causes. One of the causes is that students are not engaged and do not feel connected with other students. And this is question 2. Question 2 says, explain the relationship between student engagement in the boarding program and student behaviour. When students are actively involved in interesting, engaging activities, they're much less likely to have the time or opportunity for poor behaviour. A positive school culture means that high school students who feel like they belong have higher self-esteem, higher resilience, and higher happiness. Boarding schools with positive cultures have higher academic achievement and psychological well-being. Boarding schools with positive cultures have lower rates of substance abuse, absenteeism, and bullying and suspension. We want to move on to look at the rights of the child, the rights of the student. One of the main human rights in the United Nations Convention on Rights of the Child is that the best interest of the child must be a primary consideration in all decisions and actions. The human rights and freedoms for young people in Australia include an adequate standard of living, including an adequate food, clothing and housing, the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health, life and to be safe and free from violence, education, to be able to express their own views and have them taken into account, to be detained only as a last resort and for the shortest possible time, fair working conditions and privacy. These are all human rights and freedoms for young people in Australia. One of those that we just looked at is for young people to be able to express their own views and have those views taken into account. And question 3 asks, how do we do this well in boarding? How can we do this well in boarding? Enable young people to express their own views and to have these views taken into account. The second part of this unit is about interactions with students, and those interactions need to be fair, just, humane, equitable and positive. Question 4 asks, what does this mean in a boarding context? So fair means treating students equally without favouritism or discrimination. Just means interactions with boarders based on what is morally right and fair. Humane means showing kindness, care and empathy towards boarders. Equitable means giving reasonable support to all boarders based on their needs. Positive means connected, optimistic and hopeful interactions with boarders. The second part of this question asks, what is the difference between equality and equity? And you can probably see it pretty clearly in this picture. You've got equality on the left-hand side where everybody's given a box of the same size, which means that some people can't even see over the fence, and equity where different people are given different boxes based on their needs, which means that everybody can see over the fence. Equality has to do with giving each student the exact same resource, like the 3 boxes, where equity involves distributing resources based on the needs of the recipients to bring them up to the same level. There will be legal, ethical and organisation requirements for positive behaviour. Boarding staff must facilitate responsible behaviour within state and federal laws. So, for example, you can't use corporal punishment. Ethical consideration, and particularly staff to student boundaries, and boarding residents' code of conduct, policies and procedures. Policies and procedures. So question 5 asks, what is the name of your organisation's policy on student behaviour, and where is the policy located? You know, for example, is it in a file, like a hard copy in the staff room? Is it on C drive? Where is it located? A strong current of positive behaviours requires strong, caring staff-boarder relationships. So let's talk about relationship. Positive student relationships are fundamental to success. Students are more likely to engage in learning and have better academic outcomes if there's this positive student relationships, and they will have fewer behavioural problems. Question 6. The notes list 4 results of positive staff-student relationships. What are they? Okay, the first one is that positive relationships build motivation. Positive relationships are built on positive interactions. When you have a positive interaction with a student, the student's brain releases dopamine. This creates a cycle. You provide positive feedback, the student's brain releases dopamine, the student feels good and is motivated to feel that way again, and so you get this cycle. Number 2, positive relationships create safe spaces for learning. Social activities like talking and laughing cause the body to release the hormone oxytocin. This creates a feeling of psychological safety. When students feel psychologically safe, they're more likely to engage. But this is harder for some students. For example, a student seems to overreact. This might result from trauma or chronic stress in their life. It can cause them to feel threatened in situations that other students find harmless. The brain feels the environment is not safe and it remains on alert. So looking at the amygdala, if something feels like a threat, the amygdala sets off alarm and it releases the cortisol, the stress hormone, and epinephrine, adrenaline, and this sends extra energy throughout the body. Muscles tense, heartbeat quickens, and as they prepare for fight or flight. When the threat detection system is highly activated, this is opposite to psychological safety. In this situation, this might look like avoiding engaging in work, putting their heads down, yelling or making negative comments, walking out of the room, or any sort of violent or aggressive behaviour. So that was positive relationships create safe spaces for learning. All right, let's have a look at the third one. Positive relationships build new pathways for learning. So this is like developing a new neural pathway, like forging a new trail in the forest. So if we can tap into the student's background knowledge and activate these new pathways in the brain, this takes time, work, and repetition to get to know a student, to know what interests them, to know where they're going, that sort of thing. And so if you do this, if you can take the time, the work, and the repetition, then you can start where another trail already exists and work with that student at forging these new neural pathways. Number 4 is about positive relationships improve student behaviour. And very often students might be mirroring the behaviours of boarding staff. And so your words and your actions do matter. So when we're thinking about relationships, what are our actions? What actions are important? It's things like knowing your boarders' names, knowing where they come from, learning a bit about their families, learning their interests, spend time talking with them, listen to their stories, and what's happened in their lives. All of these sort of actions will develop relationships with boarders. Continuing part 2, interactions with students, we want to look at communication strategies. And there are 6 strategies altogether. The first of these is to make sure that your message is clear. So communicate goals clearly, communicate ideas in short, simple manner, ask for feedback, clarify ideas when necessary, check for understanding. So that's all about making sure that your message is clear. The second part is about speaking with confidence. And question 7 asks, list 4 recommendations for your communication style in this section, speaking with confidence, that will result in boarders responding more appropriately. And so there are 4 parts to this. One is predictable. Practice a response to acknowledge and encourage appropriate behaviour and discourage inappropriate behaviour. Clear. Be specific about the behaviour you see. Remain calm and in control. Concise. Make statements about residents' expectations, then disengage and allow students to meet those expectations. So does that make sense? So you make the sentence or you make the statement and then you disengage, step back, and give the student time to meet those expectations. Respectful. Always remember to remain professional and to speak to boarders with respect. You must model the behaviour that you want to see. So you can see those 4 parts to speaking with confidence. When boarders realise that your reaction is consistent, calm and controlled, they will be less inclined to persist in challenging you because they know that the result will always be the same. The next part is about rehearsing. Rehearse what you say before a meeting or an interview, or when you're interacting with a student. This can make you feel more self-assured and prevent you from losing control of difficult situations. Non-verbal communication. Non-verbal cues such as eye contact, facial expression, posture, hand movement and gestures are loaded with social and emotional information and are very important. So we just need to watch these non-verbal cues, watch our body language. Number 5 is being aware of cultural differences. And question 8 asks, what are 4 things to consider to communicate well with culturally diverse students? Be aware of cultural differences. So develop your cultural awareness and be inclusive. Respect that expectations of appropriate behaviour may differ between cultures. Don't make false assumptions based on cultural backgrounds. Evaluate how well your activities and programs meet students' needs. Boarders, particularly boarders from different cultures, should feel valued for what they bring to the boarding residents. Number 6 is using directive language, and this is interesting, and I think it's probably important for making sure that we can achieve positive behaviour from the students. So number 1 is about reframing pleading statements. So instead of saying, could you please be quiet and listen, I need you to pay attention. You see how that's a pleading statement? You could try something like, settle down, thanks, a couple of students need to listen, thank you, something like that. So not a pleading statement. Question 9 says, read the notes on using directive language. Give an example of each of the following. And there's a pleading request, an alternative to a pleading request, a confrontation request, an alternative to a confrontation request. In following up, instead of saying, I told you to be quiet, why are you boys still talking? Try something like this. Excuse me for a second, everybody. Jack, Robbie, we can chat after I'm finished. Right now I've got some things to talk about as a group. Thank you. And ignore any sulking from students as you refocus the group. Example 3 is about avoiding confrontation. Instead of saying, don't look at me like that, I told you to get a move on, move over there now, you've got an extra duty now. So instead of that sort of confrontation, try ignoring the bait and keep group momentum. People have finished their duties, are able to be checked off now, thank you. So something like that. Try reminding boarders of expectations and provide a choice. We've got a residence rule about safe and healthy standards in our rooms. You've got a choice to make. You can work to that standard now or be repeating this cleanup later. And so I think that this whole section on directive language is very important. And just going back over it again, try not to use pleading statements and try not to use confrontational language, and give boarders a choice, so that they've got a choice about doing the right thing here and now or some sort of consequence later on. And then we want to talk about assertive discipline. And question 10 asks, what is assertiveness in communication? So you can see an assertive scale there, on the left-hand side you've got passive, like a martyr, then you've got assertive in the middle, that's what we want to achieve, and then you've got passive-aggressive and aggressive. So we want to be that person in the middle, not passive, not aggressive, but assertive. Assertive communication means that you can stand up for what you believe is right, ask for what you want, say no to what you don't want in a way that's confident, calm, but also respectful. So that's what being assertive means. And I think that this is very important in facilitating positive behaviour. How you can be more assertive. Assertiveness is a skill that can be built and developed over time. Becoming more assertive takes sustained effort and commitment, and you can do this by starting small in lower stakes situations. So it might be something like, deciding what you're going to have for dinner tonight, and so just be assertive and say, well, I would like this. Making imperfect decisions. Don't think that every time our decisions need to be perfect. Not apologising if you haven't done anything wrong. Get comfortable about saying no, and not trying to manage how other people feel all the time. And so you can see question 10. Question 10 firstly asks, what is assertiveness in communication? And then secondly it says, in the assertive behaviours below, rate yourself. As in 1, I do this confidently. 2, I do this occasionally or sometimes. 3, I need to do this more often. So you can write those numbers against each of those statements. We want to move on to look at special needs students. When we're looking at special needs students, there's 6 categories: autism spectrum disorder, hearing impairment, intellectual disability, physical impairment, speech language impairment, and vision impairment. With special needs students, we need to establish residence rules and routines, accommodate individual instructional needs, praise appropriate student behaviour, model appropriate behaviour, and show empathy and kindness. Question 11 asks, when working with young people with a disability, what is the main Commonwealth legislation and what does this actually mean in practical terms? So the main legislation is the Commonwealth Disability Discrimination Act 1992, which imposes legal obligations not to discriminate against people with a disability. In practical terms, that means in boarding residences, we must ensure that a person with a disability is not discriminated against, and we must make changes to any practice or procedure that deliberately or inadvertently discriminates against young people with a disability. So you can use that to answer question 11. The third part of this unit is observe and monitor, effective supervision processes. A strong current of positive student behaviour requires effective supervision processes. We want to look at duty of care and behaviour. Question 12 asks, explain why supporting positive student behaviour is a part of our duty of care. So duty of care is where we have a legal duty to protect students from harm that reasonably ought to have been foreseen. So ensuring a standard of student behaviour that protects students from harm, from their own action and inaction, or the actions of others. So you can see how duty of care and behaviour is linked. So we need to ensure this standard of student behaviour so that we can maintain a standard of care. We want to look at staff-student ratios. Question 13 says, there are no mandated staff to student ratios in Australia. How can a boarding residence ensure that they have the correct number of staff for their context? So how many staff is enough? And you can see why the number of staff, or the staff to student ratio, is an important factor in ensuring positive student behaviours. The boarding standard for Australian schools and residences says that requirements relating to boarder care and supervision shall include risk management processes used to determine the ratios of staff to boarders for all circumstances, and that is trained staff. A correct ratio is essential for the care and safety of students. It's also essential to maintaining a boarding environment that enables positive student behaviour. Observing and monitoring students. Question 14. Question 14 asks, observing and monitoring students is a crucial part of a residential supervisor's practice for what 5 reasons? These reasons. It provides an optimal level of duty of care. We've already talked about that. It meets the needs of the students, all the different needs. It provides an environment that facilitates student development. It acknowledges strength, achievement, positive behaviours and growth, and enables us to be aware and to respond to signs of concern. So being aware and responding to signs of concern such as young people appearing to be unhappy, distressed or unwell, at risk or unacceptable behaviour, not involved with the residential program, not engaging with the program, not engaged with other staff or students, strain, anxiety, tension or poor coping skills, any significant changes to student attitude or behaviour. In observing and monitoring students, we look at informal and formal methods. Informal methods include observation of behaviour, body language, etc., feedback from students, parents and others, complaints from students and others, supporting a student to self-monitor, checking in with colleagues and service providers. Formal is behavioural observation records or charts, routine documentation of incidents in student files, interviews of students or significant others, checklists and inventories, regular mentoring sessions, formal monitoring using a tool such as a student tracking tool, and case notes. And so the question 16 asks us, list 3 formal processes that your residence uses for observing and monitoring students. During observation, screen for issues or potential harm. So some behaviours might show risk of harm to themselves, harm to another student, such as conflict or bullying other students, harm or abuse from another person. So the behavioural signs and body language to watch for are things like pacing, agitation and fidgeting, raised voices, tone of voice, sighing or rolling of eyes, defensive posture such as arms crossed, clenched fist, withdrawn or unusually quiet or distracted, staring in a confronting manner. Question 17 says, what sort of behaviour or behavioural warning signs would a supervisor watch for? And list 6 of these. When you observe students over time, this enables you to gain perspective about a student's functioning, their behaviour and presenting issues, and you can identify the frequency of behaviours, identify special needs, risks, etc. So this observing over time enables perspective. When we're observing, evaluations should be fair, objective and consistent. And question 18 says, when observing and evaluating a student's behaviour and disposition, it is important that our evaluations are fair, objective and consistent. So how is this defined? How do we define this? So fair is to treat equally without favouritism or discrimination. Objective is to be impartial and unbiased, not influenced by a personal feeling or opinion. Consistent is the same judgments over time, fair and accurate. So that's for question 18. When observing student behaviour, we need to document, and so when we're doing this, record only what you see and hear. Don't make judgments, to remain objective, so no subjective interpretation of events. Record the date, the time and the activity. Document who the observer was and the context of the observation. Follow policies and procedures and correct protocol, particularly confidentiality. Part 4, responding to student behaviour. Student behaviour varies from positive, inclusive, respectful behaviour, which is what we want, to serious behaviours of concern. And you can see them on this scale here, this table, the 4 types of behaviour: positive, inclusive and respectful behaviours, low-level, age-appropriate misbehaviour, challenging and disruptive behaviour, serious behaviours of concern. Question 20 says this: there are 4 different types of behaviours listed. Give an example of each from your own boarding experience and explain how you would respond to each type of behaviour. There are universal strategies for all young people, things such as the explicit teaching of behavioural expectations, clear boundaries in place, high rates of acknowledgement of expected behaviours or positive behaviours, consistent routines, effective engagement and active supervision. And I hope you look at these universal strategies and ensure that you have these in place in your own residence and that these are a part of your own practice, these kind of foundations for behaviour for all young people. Looking at positive, inclusive and respectful behaviours, these behaviours should be identified, recognised, with positive recognition. Low-level developmentally appropriate misbehaviours. These test the boundaries of established rules and standards. They're usually simple to redirect and minimise. You use those universal behaviour support strategies such as positive behaviour intervention, and you can use careful use of consequences. Challenging behaviours are a greater concern due to their severity, their frequency or their duration. They require more persistent guidance and support to minimise. So responses include positive behaviour intervention, careful use of consequences, and targeted interventions. Complex and unsafe behaviours or behaviours of concern that are of severe or high frequency or extended duration or unsafe for a young person or those around them. These require an assessment called a functional behaviour assessment, individual behaviour plans, targeted and universal strategies, and collaboration with parents or guardians, and you probably include referral to health professionals or other professionals. Positive behaviour support should include these things that we talked about before, and this is question 21. What would you expect to see in positive behaviour support? List 5 of them. And so I want to go through them again because I think they're so important. Just defining and teaching expected behaviours, encouraging expected behaviours with things like signs, reward systems, reinforcement, explicit and incidental teaching, consistent routines, strategies to ensure that you've got interesting, engaging activities, and effective and active supervision. And so that will help you with question 21. These are examples of positive behavioural interventions. Routines. Ensure that there are clear routines. Induct students into routines at the beginning of the year, for example. Give opportunities to practice routines. Provide ongoing support for routines and expected behaviours. Take a break. When overwhelmed or overstimulated, it may benefit for a student to take a short break to reset and get focused again. Breaks allow time for self-management and self-regulation. Self-management allows young people to pause, reflect, and then adjust their problematic behaviour. Silent signals. Create silent signals to remind young people to pay attention or to follow a direction. This can be for a whole group or for one student who needs extra support. Effective to quickly reinforce expectations with minimal disruption. Proximity. This is a good silent intervention. Just by getting physically closer to a young person, you can redirect their behaviour. Quiet correction. Some negative behaviour can be seeking attention. If you quietly whisper an instruction to a student, you then remove the audience because obviously the other students can't hear what you've said. It removes the possibility of shame, that person losing face, and making them react further. So you remain in control of the situation, you keep the students' privacy, and you remove the audience. Give a task. At some times of the day, it can be useful to give a task or an errand to complete. This gives the student a chance to reset and come back changed. Pairing a young person up with a buddy as a helper can build leadership and community skills. Positive phrasing. Remind of the positive target behaviour rather than negative demand. So rather than saying, don't run in the hall, that's against the rules, you would say, we always walk in the hall. Tangible reinforcers. Rewards can be effective to encourage positive behaviours. You need clear guidelines for how to earn rewards and realistic goals, etc. One of the ways that we can respond to behaviour is by ignoring that behaviour. If the behaviour is low level and can be ignored, then it may stop. Try turning or walking away. There are 3 basic guidelines for ignoring behaviour, and this is question 22. This says some behaviour can be intentionally ignored. What are 3 guidelines for ignoring behaviour? The first is to give the student no recognition. So the student is exhibiting this low-level behaviour, so you give them no recognition, no eye contact, physical contact, or in any way acknowledge the student. The second is to be consistent. Ignoring once and then paying attention the next time will only increase the intensity of the behaviour. Recognise the student as soon as the unacceptable behaviour stops, and always combine ignoring with other encouraging positive behaviour strategies. Never ignore behaviour that could harm a person or damage property. Never ignore behaviour that's a clear breach of residence rules. It can be difficult to ignore behaviour. It doesn't always render immediate results, and it requires all supervisors to have a consistent approach. And so the example I've given in the past is where in a class I had once, a student would tap. They would just tap with their pen. And I found that if I ignored that behaviour and followed those rules, giving the student no recognition, being consistent, and then recognise the student as soon as the tapping finishes, then the student stopped and we got on with what we were doing. When we respond to behaviour, there is a continuum from authoritarian to self-regulating. And so you can see that here, these 2 extremes. So this should be a continuum. It's just a table, but this should be a continuum. On the left-hand side, you've got self-regulating. Then you have all these other behaviours right across to authoritarian. And you can see this table. Self-regulating is young person-centred. The young people choose responsible behaviours. And how to achieve this is to support and train young people to make positive behaviour choices, empower to build self-control and self-regulation to manage their own behaviour. Authoritarian, which is right up the other end of the scale, is adult-centred, have strict rules and expectations, very demanding and not very responsive, doesn't express very much warmth or nurturing, utilises punishment with little or no explanation, doesn't give the young person choices or options. An adult has the authority, makes rigid rules, and punishes young people who break the rules or who don't comply. And so that's right up one end of the spectrum. Self-regulating is right down the other end. Question 23 says the continuum responding to behaviour ranges from self-regulating to authoritarian. Explain what self-regulating and authoritarian responses are. Explain where your residence fits into this continuum. The authoritarian style is the least effective according to most research. Authoritarian supervisors have high expectations, strict rules, utilise punishments, often not willing to explain the reasoning behind rules, and miss many opportunities to listen, train, and build relationship. Self-regulation, this is the ideal way to enable and encourage young people to choose responsible behaviours for the right reasons, and that's caring for and respecting themselves, respecting other people and their feelings, valuing relationships, and respecting people's belongings and property. This strategy means supporting and training young people to make positive behaviour choices, giving responsibility to manage their own behaviour, and room to build self-control and self-regulation. Ways to empower students to self-regulate their behaviour. These are different ways to do that. So cut back on adults regulating and policing, cut back on visible lists of rules and regulations, model and teach how to make good decisions and solve problems, don't immediately apply consequences, Give a referral, to talk privately about the problem and discuss strategies for dealing with it, making it right, which is a part of restorative justice. A higher likelihood of the student changing their behaviour, and emphasise and acknowledge positive behaviour and effort. Learning to reflect. Assist students to reflect on their own behaviour and evaluate their own behaviour. The restorative justice framework helps students reflect, be accountable, and restore relationships. So facilitating accountability will take more time. It may need more meetings with the student. The student may choose the wrong behaviour again and again before they eventually learn positive behaviours. The supervisor will need to be patient. If we can understand the causes of challenging behaviour, we can more effectively address the behaviour. And this is question 24. Question 24 is saying there are 10 causes of challenging behaviour listed in the notes. Describe 3 of them and give an example from your own students. So these are possible causes of behaviour. Biophysical factors, so medical conditions or disabilities. Psychological factors, trauma or lack of social skills. Behavioural or social factors, so learned problem behaviour through reinforcement, consequences or adaptation to social practice. For example, a student misbehaves knowing they'll be removed from class, and they do this to avoid their learning difficulties being exposed to other students. Historical community factors. Some Indigenous students' family members had difficult traumatic experiences at school. Cultural factors. Indigenous community sorry business. Student group dynamics. Bullying, teasing, cliques, apathy, hostility. Environmental factors. Level of noise. Dining room seating. Recreation room size and organisation, that sort of thing. Staff issues such as inconsistent routines, ineffective supervision, lack of awareness of cultural differences. Boarding program factors, lack of engaging activities, disorganised program or bored students. Behaviour management factors, overreaction to misbehaviour or over-reliance on punishment. Often there's no single cause of a behaviour, but it might be a result of several factors in combination. Triggers can prompt a particular correct behaviour. For example, the supervisor wants the students to listen, call for attention with a signal, wait for quiet to trigger the desired behaviour. A bus driver waits before moving off, before all behaviour is appropriate. So these are triggers which prompt a desired behaviour. Some actions or events trigger students' challenging behaviour, and this is question 25. Explain what a trigger is for challenging behaviour and give an example. So a student has learning difficulties, so being pushed in study time might trigger a negative behaviour. Teasing might trigger a behaviour to fight or flight. Okay, so we want to look at consequences. Responding to behaviour with consequences can teach a young person to take responsibility for their actions and make positive choices. And there are 2 types of consequences, a logical consequence and a natural consequence. Question 26 says, what is the difference between a natural and a logical consequence? And give an example of each. A natural consequence has no adult involvement. So a student forgets his homework leave form and to get it in on time, so he misses out on leave. A student who spends all his pocket money on the first day will have nothing for the weekend. So young people learn from these natural consequences. A logical consequence, this is when an adult intervenes with a consequence that flows from poor behaviour. So the student who painted graffiti on the wall is asked to fix it. They need to clean the graffiti off. Students loud and disruptive in the TV room may be removed or banned from the TV room. We want to look now at the different types of negative consequences, and these range from very mild consequences, such as something like a raised hand or a sign or a signal, up to quite serious consequences, such as being suspended from boarding. You'll see that question 27 asks you to match behaviours with the sort of consequence that you would expect for those behaviours. So in this table we have the types of negative consequences, a description of those consequences and an example. So a non-verbal negative consequence is a sign or signal from the boarding supervisor in response to behaviour. An example is a raised hand or a finger to the lips to request quiet. A short verbal is a brief comment in response to a behaviour, so reminding a young person of the correct behaviour. We don't run in the hall, we walk, that sort of thing. A correction is where a student is required to correctly display the desired behaviour. If the young person is running down the hall, have them return and walk instead, give them an opportunity to do it right. Restitution, where a young person is required to correct the result of negative behaviour. If the young person breaks something, then they're required to repair it or pay for the cost of replacing it. Loss of privilege. The young person loses a privilege, so the young person uses their phone late at night in breach of the phone use agreement. For a week, they are required to hand in their phone at bedtime. Timeout. A young person is removed from an activity or a location. Student is loud and disruptive when other students are watching a movie. The student is required to leave the theatre and sit in the office. Task. The young person is allocated a task or additional duties in response to poor behaviour. A student is swearing and using abusive language. The student is required to carry out 1 hour cleaning task. Note, the students are aware that if they use abusive language, the consequences will be additional duties. A conference with the head of boarding or the principal. The young person is involved in a conference with senior staff to discuss the behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. When asked to leave the TV room and go to bed, a student refuses to follow the instruction and remains in the TV room for another 10 minutes. The same behaviour had occurred on previous occasions. The student is required to attend a conference with senior staff to develop strategies to change that behaviour. A conference with parents. As a result of serious negative behaviour, the student is involved in a conference with senior staff and their parents or their guardians to discuss the behaviour and strategies to change the behaviour. An example, a student brought alcohol to the residence, shared it with other students who became intoxicated. The student is required to attend a meeting with the head of boarding and their parents to discuss the incident and any further consequences. And then suspension. As a result of a very serious negative behaviour, the student is suspended from the boarding residence for a period of time. So a student starts a fight and assaults another student, causing injury. The student is suspended from the residence for 2 weeks. Students are aware that assaulting another student will result in suspension from the residence. So you can see that group of consequences ranging from quite mild up to quite serious, depending, of course, on the behaviours. There are guidelines for using negative consequences, and there are quite a few of these, but these are very important as we need to be very careful about how we give negative consequences. So let's have a look at these. And I'd encourage you to go back through these a few times so that you can understand them and understand particularly how they apply to your context. So make it clear what the problem behaviour is and what the consequence is for engaging in that behaviour. Deliver the consequence, don't just threaten. Always use consequences that are safe and respect dignity and basic rights. Use negative consequences as a teaching tool, not a punishing tool. Be consistent. The severity of the consequence is not as important as its certainty. Students won't learn if they sometimes get away with it. Be careful about how and when the consequence is delivered. Don't give the consequence in public, in front of peers. Deliver the negative consequence in a calm, matter-of-fact way. Showing emotion will cause the student to react emotionally and not think about what they've done. They're less likely to learn from their consequence. Only implement negative consequences if positive interventions aren't working. Document the methods used and be prepared to justify why. Use the least restrictive consequence to achieve change. Choose a consequence that will bring change, not give the student what they want. And you can probably remember that example of the student who exhibited poor behaviour so they could leave the classroom because they did not want students to see their learning difficulties. So that consequence was actually giving them what they wanted. So we need to choose a consequence that will bring about change. Don't use consequences in isolation. Also use strategies that motivate the person towards new positive behaviours. Where possible, include parents in the decision, particularly about higher level consequences. Staff should react to behaviours in consistent ways and with the same consequences. Use professional judgment to check that the best outcomes for the student will be achieved, yet maintaining consistency. So there's a lot in that, but I hope you can go back through it a couple of times and just check how it fits with your particular context. We want to have a look now at functional behaviour assessment. A functional behaviour assessment, or FBA, identifies where, when and why serious behaviours of concern happen. In schools, this is called a function of the behaviour. The information is then used to develop a behaviour intervention plan. Question 28 asks, what is a functional behaviour assessment, and when is a functional behaviour assessment used? So that's question 28. A functional behaviour assessment may be carried out when a young person's behaviour gets in the way of their learning, the learning of other students, or causes harm to themselves or others. An assessment can be conducted, as often as it's needed. That's another part of question 28. The process. An FBA does not need specific supervisor qualifications, but if the behaviour poses a serious risk, it's best to engage a psychologist, a behavioural specialist, or a behaviour analyst. The steps are to identify the problem and define the behaviour, gather information about the events and consequences that are triggering and maintaining the behaviour, analyse the data to determine why the young person is demonstrating the behaviour. After the assessment, plan interventions to change the behaviour, create a behaviour support plan, implement the plan, and evaluate the effectiveness of the plan. Sources of information from the assessment, a review of the young person's school or boarding records, interviews with staff and caregivers, structured rating scales, a collection of direct observation data, identification of any health and well-being concerns or issues, consideration of environmental conditions that may impact the behaviours of concern. So that's where you get the information for the assessment. Indirect assessments involve an interview, questionnaire or rating scale. They may provide the situation and specific time that the behaviour is most likely to occur. Direct assessments involved observing the behaviour under naturally occurring conditions without changing or manipulating the environment in any way. Behaviour intervention plan, and this is question 29. What are the components of a behaviour intervention plan? It's based on the results of an FBA, or functional behaviour assessment, a description of the problem behaviour, theories as to why it occurs, and then intervention strategies such as positive behavioural supports to address the behaviour. The BIP has components such as skills training to promote appropriate behaviour, alteration of the environment to minimise or eliminate problem behaviours, strategies to encourage appropriate behaviours that replace problem behaviours, the support that the young person will need to behave appropriately, collection of data to manage the young person's progress. So they're the different components of a BIP. Continuing part 4, responding to student behaviour, we want to look at restorative practice. Restorative practice is a positive approach that works with students rather than doing things for students or to students, and you can see that in this social discipline window. So the aim is to work with students, not to do things to them, not to do things for them, and not to neglect students. Restorative practice promotes self-regulation, encourages behaviour that is supportive and respectful, and it puts the onus on individuals to be truly accountable for their behaviour and to repair any harm that's caused to others as a result of their behaviour. It's not a blame and punish approach, and this has been a traditional approach to dealing with behaviour issues. We say who is to blame and how will they be punished. That's traditionally how we have managed behaviour. This approach is not a blame and punish approach. It avoids scolding, judging, lecturing. It accepts that we all make mistakes and we have the ability to fix those mistakes, and we can learn from our experience. The blame and punish approach causes shame, and you can see on this compass of shame the results of that shame for a student. It can cause a student to withdraw, to attack others, to attack themselves, or it just can cause avoidance. There's lots of questions used in restorative practice. These questions make us think about consequences that can elicit empathy, remorse, and learning. So who has been affected by what has happened? In restorative practice, we use a little card like this when we're working with students. What happened? What were you thinking of at the time? What have you thought about since? Who's been affected by this? And what do you think you need to do to make this right? How can you fix this up? And so, for example, you might have two students who have been fighting, have had an argument, something like that. And so you would sit those two students down and you would ask them these questions. You would ask one student, and the other student must be quiet and listen while the other person's talking, and then they have their turn. So they explain what happened, how you've been affected by this, and then how it can be fixed up. These are effective restorative questions, and I'd encourage you to go back and read through all of this later. And if you're using this process in your school or in your boarding residence, then you should go back and look in detail at these questions and the reason that we use these questions. What happened? What were you thinking about at the time? And this develops that emotional literacy by linking thoughts and feelings and actions. What have your thoughts been since? Who has been affected by what has happened? In what way have they been affected? What do you think you need to do to make things right? If the same thing happened again, would you do things differently? So these are effective restorative questions. In this process, we often use this form here, a tell your story form. And so before the process, a student would fill out this form. When working restoratively, avoid interrogation or asking why, because this can cause a defensive response. Ask specific questions that encourage reflection and problem solving. Have opportunities to understand the impact of behaviour on other people. Recognise that in some situations there's no quick fix. It may require time and support to see that behaviour change. There is a continuum of strategies, and these range from informal conversations, positive classroom management strategies, logical consequences, collaborative problem solving, trained peer support teams, structured one-on-one conversations, mediation, conferencing, and circle time. And I would encourage you to go back, read the notes, and unpack this in detail. It's a very useful strategy that works very well. So continuing part 5, we want to look at procedural fairness. So this is following a fair and proper procedure when making a decision about a student's behaviour. So procedural fairness is very important. In procedural fairness, the complaint or accusation is made clear to the student or the parents or both. You hear both sides of the story, and you can use incident reports and tell your story forms. You should be gathering evidence from witnesses that support the decision, and there should be evidence of an inquiry made by an unbiased decision maker that acts reasonably with privacy and timely, doesn't take forever. I want to just tell you about this example from New Zealand. So 2 New Zealand schoolboy rowers were banned from competing in a regatta. And so these students were from St Bede's College in Christchurch, and this happened in 2015. These students were in transit at an airport. The coach went to pick up the rental van, and 2 boys, encouraged and filmed by their peers, jumped on the baggage carousel and rode the baggage carousel into the secure baggage area. And you probably understand that is a pretty serious issue. They were interviewed by airport security and staff and police, and no further action was taken by the authorities. But the college decided to suspend the boys and send them home. They banned them from competing in the regatta. So what happened next? The following day, contacted by the parents' lawyers, the school was invited to reconsider the decision. There was an allegation that college did not use a fair process, and the decision is serious and disproportionate with consequences for their future. Parents got a High Court injunction in an urgent hearing less than 3 hours before the students were to compete, and this is what the court determined. The court determined the decision was made on the basis of an email from the head coach who was not present at the time. The boys in question were not interviewed, witnesses were not interviewed, information about the consequences of the decision was not gathered. And so you can see how procedural fairness was not followed in that case, and so it was overturned and those students ended up competing. So what about procedural fairness in the boarding context? And this will help you with question 31. It's about listening to the student's explanation, so an appropriate hearing. It's about no bias in any aspect of the event. It's about evidence of the student's unacceptable behaviour relating to the event, so gathering that evidence, interviewing people, etc. A proper inquiry into the circumstances of the event, and then treating everybody with respect and courtesy. So you probably see that procedural fairness is not really looking at the outcome, it's looking at the process that you used to get to the outcome. A fair process is about an appropriate hearing, no bias, enough evidence, and a proper inquiry. That's what a fair process is about. Continuing part 5, we want to look at recording and reporting incidents of behaviour. So keep detailed record of instances of challenging and disruptive behaviour, serious behaviours of concern, and the organisation's responses to the behaviour. The recording and reporting should be consistent with the organisation's policies and procedures, and it should focus on the facts of the situation and not any vague or unsubstantiated claims or judgments. Question 32 asks, how does your residence record and report incidents and critical incidents? Student management programs with online reporting programs, that's one option for recording and reporting. Incident report forms in student folders, in the school online filing system, or in hard copies in filing cabinets, or critical incident reports. More serious situations need a different process of reporting and recording. So if you can answer that question, how does your residence report and record behaviour incidents and critical incidents? Aggressive and violent behaviour, part 5. To anticipate aggressive behaviour before it occurs, be observant and engaged, be alert to signs of tension, and know your students and know their triggers. Where there's hostile communication, remain mirror calm, respond professionally, respond with empathy, and don't take it personally. There might be lots of different reasons why a student is acting like they are. It's not something personal. We want to look at de-escalation strategies, and there's quite a few of these, and you're probably going to need to go through these several times, but you should have a a de-escalation strategy yourself for students who are escalated. And this is question 33. This says there are 13 guidelines for de-escalating. What do you see as the 3 most important? So choose 3 out of this list that you think are most important. Okay, try to remove anything or any person that is causing the aggression. Do not block or corner people who are upset. Keep 2 arms lengths distance away from the person. Keep your body posture open and don't appear to be hiding anything. Keep your body posture relaxed, even if it's hard. Be mindful of gestures, facial expressions and movement, that sort of body language. Keep your body language neutral. Remain calm, rational and professional, and that can be hard sometimes, but that's how we need to remain. Ask the student what would make them feel safe or what would make them feel better. Ask them what could help or what could happen next. Don't be judgmental. Try to be low and slow. This refers both to your body movements and your voice, so that your body is low, get down on the same level as the student, and that your voice is low. Use the strategy to name it, to tame it. So when you name emotions, you can gain control over them. Use the approach to regulate over educate. So you're regulating the emotions. You're not using this opportunity to try and educate a student. Ignore challenging questions. Give the person space and time. During the process and afterwards, it is important to validate the person and to show empathy. If a person's escalated, it can take 20 or 30 minutes for them to de-escalate. So that's why we need to give that person time to de-escalate and to come back to who they really are. Next part of this section is about physical restraint and physical intervention. Physical restraint is the use of physical force to prevent, restrict or subdue the movement of a student's body or part of their body. Students are not free to move away when they're being physically restrained. So that's physical restraint, and that's different to physical intervention. Physical intervention uses physical contact to block, deflect or redirect a student's actions or to disengage a student's grip, but from which a student can move freely away. Physical restraint should only be used in exceptional circumstances, where there is a real and immediate risk of injury to the student and to others, where the physical restraint is a reasonable response to prevent harm, and where there is no less restrictive measure that you could use in the circumstance. And this is question 34. Question 34 asks, in what circumstances would you use physical restraint? So only where there's real and immediate risk of injury, where it's a reasonable response, and where there's no less restrictive measure available. Question 35 says, in a situation that may require physical restraint, how can a supervisor stay safe? So it's important that you stay safe. You should not use physical restraint or intervention if there is a risk of injury to yourself. You should ensure that your actions are consistent with your organisation's policies and procedures. Most organisations prohibit physical restraint that covers a student's mouth or nose or in any way interferes with breathing, that takes a student to the ground into the prone or supine position, applies pressure to the neck, back, chest or joints, applies pain to get compliance, intentionally causes a student to fall, includes a person sitting, lying or kneeling on a student. So most organisations prohibit that sort of physical restraint. After physical restraint, provide support for the students and the staff involved, report the incident to the head of boarding, make sure you document the incident, notify parents and carers, and then later review the incident for alternative actions and consider any preventative or de-escalation strategies that might reduce the likelihood of this sort of incident happening again. The next part of this is about student referrals. Some student behaviours result in referrals to specialists such as counsellors, psychologists, psychiatrists and health professionals. Referrals will often be made by case management teams or resident school specialists, such as your health professionals. Policies and procedures for referrals will detail the permissions that are necessary for professional referrals, and this is usually the parent or student, depending on the age, and the resident or organisation management. So student referrals, and this is question 36. What is your organisation's process for referring students to a specialist for advice? Section 6, self-harm and suicide. Self-harm can be the physical pain that masks the internal pain. So when the internal pain, the internal hurt is so bad, then physical pain can mask that internal pain. Or it can be the need to feel something rather than just numbness or depression. It's not an indicator of suicide, but it can lead to suicide. What these people need is to be cared about and to know that people care for them. Supervisors become aware of suicide risk by observing behaviour like indicators, or somebody tells them. So that somebody could be a friend, could be the person themselves, it could be a parent or a health professional or somebody like that, but somebody tells you that a person is a suicide risk, or you observe the indicators. These are the risk factors for young people: previous suicide attempts, using substances such as drugs or alcohol, having a mental health condition such as anxiety, depression, bipolar, PTSD, problems with family or romantic relationships such as a breakup, legal problems, a recent death or suicide of a close friend or a family member, being bullied, having access to potentially harmful medication or weapons, having a physical illness or disability, being gay, lesbian, bisexual, gender diverse or intersex, being Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander. This graph shows the suicide deaths of children and young people from 2010 to 2020, and it's in age groups 14 and below, and you can see the numbers for 14 and below are quite low. 15 to 17 and then 19 to 24, and for older students the number of deaths increase. So what are the protective factors? Connection through family, school, community. The more connection, the better. Significant others, the presence of a caring adult or a caring partner. Personal resilience associated with a positive coping style and problem-solving skills. Spirituality and beliefs, a sense of meaning, spiritual faith, belief that suicide is wrong. Good health, positive physical and mental health is protective. Early detection and treatment of disorders such as depression, and restricted access to things like weapons and drugs, etc. Indicators are pulling away from friends, loss of interest in activities, trouble concentrating, giving away belongings, talking about death, suicide, talking about feeling hopeless or guilty, changing sleep or eating habits, sudden trouble in school or boarding, sudden change such as calmness after a period of anxiety, self-destructive behaviours such as drinking, drug use, cutting, etc. When we look at how we respond to this, we want to look at, firstly, a student who is not themselves, so they might be down, you might feel that they're depressed, and we want to look at students who we believe are at risk of suicide. So firstly, let's look at this first group. This is a student who's not themselves, they're quiet, they're not engaging, they just seem to be down or not themselves. You might think that they are depressed. So with these students, we monitor them. We discuss and document the situation. So we would discuss this with our peers, and we'd talk to the head of boarding. Don't leave them alone. You can buddy them up with another student. Encourage activity and connection. Show that you care. Listen with empathy. Access help and support such as a care plan, referral, etc. Obviously, if a student remains down or gets worse, then you probably need to think that they could be a suicide risk. There are helplines, these helplines here. And then we look at a student who is at risk of suicide, or we believe they're at risk of suicide, and you need to refer to your organisation procedure for this. If you believe a student is at risk of suicide, ask them directly, are you thinking of taking your own life? And the reason we do this is that we need to know. We need to know so that we can prevent it from occurring. And, you might get a response like a student might say to you, oh, things have been pretty bad lately, or I do feel pretty down. And if they say something like that, then obviously they're at risk of suicide. Or a student might say to you, oh, no, I've just had some problems at home and, mum and dad aren't getting on and, it's affecting me. So if they say something like that, they're possibly less likely to be at risk of suicide. But you need to ask them very directly. If you're working with Indigenous students, you need to talk to an Indigenous elder about the students in your area, and if it's appropriate, to ask them directly. Some Indigenous elders will say that they don't do that, it's not culturally correct, they do it a different way. So they come at it from a different angle. Otherwise, ask the student this question. Secondly, don't leave the student alone. So that means don't leave them alone at all. So if they need to go to the toilet, you would stand outside the toilet door and talk to them while they're in there. That sort of thing, so that they're just not left alone at all. And it's not appropriate to buddy them up with another student. This is a serious situation and they should have adults or health professionals around them. You need to advise the boarding manager and also anyone else who needs to know. So that's probably other boarding staff and obviously parents. The boarding manager is probably going to contact the parents. And then you would get professional assistance immediately. For many schools and residences, this means involving your school nurse, a psychologist, a health professional who's on site. But for others, it will mean getting this student to hospital as quickly as you can. So you need to get professional assistance as soon as you can. And then after you've done that, just to document, update the student file and keep staff informed about what's happening. So there's 5 steps. Ask very directly, don't leave the student alone, advise people who need to know, get professional assistance immediately, document, update student file and keep staff informed. Now, if the student returns to the residence, or when the student returns to the residence, you must have 2 things in place. The first is a risk management process so that you can work out the risk. Secondly, an individual care plan, and this is necessary for ongoing monitoring, care and documentation. So you would expect the resident's response to be like this. A return to residence or school meeting with school staff, parent, guardian, external support agencies, health professionals, and if appropriate, if you think it's appropriate, the student as well. And then a risk management process, and this should have been carried out by the hospital. But if not, you're going to need to put in place a risk management process, an individual care plan, and then you need to inform and update teachers and boarding supervisors and manage the safety of the student from that point on. Okay, so this is the end of Unit 4. Thank you very much.